travel far, even though I haven't been down this part of Birmingham in decades. I went to medical school here in Birmingham, and I just moved back a little over a year ago to take a job as the chief of staff at the VA. I'm also a clinical professor of psychiatry and family medicine at UAB, but I'm here in my status as a private citizen. The topic we're going to talk about today is suicide epidemiology, the latest data. There's a lot of data that came out over the course of last year on suicide rates up to 2017, and I'm going to bring you up to speed on that. I'm also going to talk a little bit about occupation-specific suicide rates. The slides you have in your hands do not reflect the latest version of what I'm going to talk about. So you can only follow me for so long if you look at your paper instead of listening to me, but we can have fun doing it. So heads up. Let me know if I talk too fast or you got a question. So I can't do this without thanking my oldest daughter, who always tells me every time I go give a talk to thank her. But she actually did work for it. She's 17, she's a junior. We're beginning the journey towards looking at what she's going to do when she grows up. And so she helps Daddy out. She's now my technical advisor for my slides. She keeps me up to date with the latest things she does with the cloud and all that fancy stuff Daddy can't quite keep up with. It used to be my wife not too long ago, but now I have a 17-year-old daughter. She's earning our keep. So she's the one who helped me create the background and some of the slides and stuff. So if you don't like it, blame her. So my official disclaimer here is that I'm here in a private capacity, not as a government employee. So anything I say reflects me and me only, not anybody else that works for the government. So my daughter's slides, as I'm sure you guys can tell. I started this talk last year, and around that time, there was a whole bunch of suicides in the news. So Kate Spade died of suicide. Avicii, famous pop singer, died of suicide. Anthony Bourdain, Robin Williams died of suicide. Even within the state of Alabama, the wife of the Attorney General, Mrs. Marshall, also died of suicide. So suicide is something that's pretty active. And all these people kind of had one thing in common. There was drug use in there, which I'm not really going to jump into much in this topic, but that's brought the epidemic of death by suicide to the forefront. So how many people have heard this song? 1-800-273-8255. Yeah, hip people, there you go. I saw it first at the Grammys, I think 2 years ago now, but at the VA we popularized 1-800-273-TALK, which is how I remember that, which number anybody anywhere in the United States can call if you're going through any kind of suicidal crisis. For veterans, you tell them to press 1 because it directs them, it's off of the same trunk, but it directs them off to a VA call center. And the song was by Logic and featured Alicia Cara and Khalid. And so lots of kids know about the National Suicide Hotline number, and the number of calls that I've been going to the National Suicide Hotline number continues to grow every year. So here's some data that I'm going to start with. First of all, when I started researching this in late 2017, the data that was out was up to 2016. Somewhere in the next 2 or 3 months, 2017 data came out. So it tells me that they're accelerating the pace at which we learn about suicide, because it used to take 2 or 3 years. It used to be that far behind. Now we're only about a year behind, which is pretty up to date in terms of data gathering. So suicide is one of the top 10 causes of death in the country. And it is one of only 3 causes of death in the top 10 that are still rising. I'm sure you all saw in the news a couple of weeks ago that death from cancer is at an all-time low since the 60s or so. Well, that's not true of suicide. It's going the other way, and it's going really fast the other way, which is kind of scary. When I was a medical student, and even after I became a resident and an early attending, it was kind of easy to say the suicide rate was kind of static back then. It was about 11.1 per 100,000. Over the course of 7 or 8 years that I gave the same talk to residents and students and staff members at my hospital in California, it didn't matter what the CDC data exactly was, because the range was somewhere between 10 and 12, really around 11. Well, that's changed over the past 5 or 6 years. It's gone up more rapidly than it has in the past, and you all will see some of that. So it is a leading cause of death. Suicide is the end result of multiple different things. It's a public health issue that needs to be addressed in a public health way. So I hope that's one of the take-home points that you get, that suicide doesn't belong to mental health alone. It belongs to everybody. Suicide rates have gone up about 33% since 1999. And 1999 is where most of the data cutoff points and comparisons start. And depending on which year's data you're using to compare, we at least have gone up 33% since then. And the latest data from the CDC showed that a little over half of the people who died by suicide did not have a known mental health condition. Now that's surprising because the way I was taught, about 90% of people who die by suicide have a known mental health or substance abuse condition. So this has raised lots of talk about what this means. Does it mean the demographics are changing, or does it mean we have patients who haven't actually been diagnosed yet by the system, and the system is failing them, which is why more people are showing up without having a known mental health diagnosis or not. And this is something worth thinking about and pondering as we go on. So between 99 and 2017, as I said, the age-adjusted suicide rate went up 33% from about 10.5 to about 14 per 100,000 people. And the rate increased on average by about 1% per year from 1999 through 2006. And then from 2006, it's accelerated, it's doubled the rate of change to 2% per year. We don't quite know why this is happening, but I remember back when I was a resident in Iowa, we were talking about the fact that it seemed younger generations coming in back then, and that'll be early 2000s, were more likely to have depression and more likely to die of suicide. And this trend hasn't changed. In fact, it's going the other way. And hopefully, as this becomes much more publicized and well known, we have the funding and things given to us to study what's going on, that suicide is not going the way as most of the other causes of death, but it's going up and making life expectancy less. For the past 2 years, the United States has had a decrease in life expectancy. First time this has happened in modern times in the United States. All these things surely are going together in some way, shape, or form. And if my memory serves me right, 2006, 2007 was around the time we had the Great Recession, right? The stock market, the housing crash. So all those figures, factors, all those things have something in common. For males, the rate increased 26% from 17.8 to 22.4 between 1999 and 2017. It did not significantly change from 1999 to 2016. So note, while the rates were changing then, it wasn't males that were driving that. You know who's driving that then, between 1999 and 2006. From 2006, it's increased about 2% a year among males. But look at females. The rate increased 53% from 4 per 100,000 to 6 per 100,000 in 2017. And now the rate has gone from 2% rate increase through 2007 to 3%. So men are more likely to die by suicide than women. Clearly, men are still much more likely, but women are beginning to catch up at a faster rate. And that's pretty scary and pretty sad, because as you look at that, you can see if this continued trajectory goes on, it's only a matter of time when women die as much as men from suicides. And we don't want that, because that's a calamity if that happens. So, but there's still quite a bit of a gap, because even though the women's rate is going up that much faster, men are at 22.4, women are at 6. It's going to take quite a few decades at that rate, I think, for men to catch up. But it's worthwhile noting the trajectory changes. And this shows you graphically what I'm talking about. You can see the male rate is kind of flat around the late 90s, the early 2000s, and then it starts to move up. You can see where the total is, which kind of mirrors the male curve, and look at the women rate going up that way. Talking about suicide rates for females specifically, the rates were highest for females for those aged between 45 and 64, both at 2 different time points, in 1999 and 2017, and I'll show you that in the next slide. Suicide rates were significantly higher in women in 2017 than in 1999 among all age groups except for one. And the one age group that it wasn't higher for was people 75 and over. It actually dropped from 99 to 2017, which is kind of funny, because when we go to the male age group, you see the same thing too, that the only age group that suicide rates didn't rise for over the past 10 or so years was in the males 75 and older. And if you remember, the age group with the highest suicide rate is 75 and older, 85 and older. The older you are, the higher rate, even though there's fewer of you in the population. So the number of suicides is less in that group. So you distinguish between the raw count and also between the rates. So the rates dropped only for those 75 and over for females. And you can see from the graph, the blue, or it's purple where you are. Did my volume just go up? Yeah. So the purple on the screen reflects 1999 data, and the green reflects 2017 data. And you can see all through that the rates went up, except for the 75 and over, where the rates actually dropped. Talking about males, similarly, the highest rates were for those aged 75 and over in both time points, and the suicide rates were significantly higher in 2017 than in 1999 among all age groups, except for those 75 and over, just like the females. And if you look at the graph, it shows you the same thing that I was talking about. So rates are going up, but the highest rate drop was in the 75 and older group. Also, there's been a difference in growth in rates between the rural and urban counties. If I was to ask you, who do you think has a higher rate of suicide? People in rural counties or people in urban counties? What would you guess? Rural. So the more rural you are, the more access you have to lethal means, which is firearms, and the more likely you are to die from suicide. And the data indeed just say that if you account for the population of the United States by rurality of county, the more rural the county is, the more the suicide rate is. And it's grown much more in the more rural areas than it has in the more urban areas. So in 2017, the age-adjusted suicide rate for the most urban counties had grown 16% from 1999. For rural areas, it grown 53% from 1999. So it was already higher in 1999, and it grew faster. So the gap has widened between deaths by suicide in rural counties and deaths by suicide in urban counties. And that's the data right there. That to the far right, in far right, shows you the most rural counties, and the green at the far left shows you the most urban counties. So you can see the difference at the 2 time points. There was like a four-person gap per 100,000 in 99, and now it's up to about 10. So that gap has widened and continues to grow. So what I hope I've shown you so far is that suicide rates are increasing all across the United States, in almost every state, and in most of the states where suicide rates increased, they increased by over 30% over that period in time. And this is, again, a graphical representation of what has happened. And then we know that people are more likely, at least as of this data, to die without having a mental health diagnosis, which could have one of several meanings. And the people who have no known mental health conditions are more likely to be male than those with known mental health conditions. And they're also more likely to kill themselves with firearms. So that's some information that we have there. At the bottom of the graphic, it tells you some of the things, some of the factors which can go into creating that particular moment where someone chooses to die by suicide. And relationship problems turn out to be a big factor, as I'm sure many of you would guess. Relationship problems. Then crisis. When people face crisis, some famous figure skating guy, John Coughlin, I think that's his name, I saw that in the news in the past couple of days, killed himself a couple of days ago, over the weekend, I believe. And the reason why he killed himself, he had legal charges pending, including some with inappropriate activity with minors. He decided he didn't want to face that. So when people have crises, when they have court cases, where they have impending loss of face and stuff like that, sometimes people make that choice. Physical health problems, people thinking they have end-stage disease or disease that's going to make their lives not worth the quality that they think that they should have. sometimes make that choice. I talked about the criminal legal problem. Loss of housing can be one of the things that precipitates to job financial problems, which is why during times of economic hardship, suicide rates rise, and substance use, which is a growing factor in our problem with suicides at this time. And you know, it's very hard to tell when somebody dies who's been using drugs, whether they intended to kill themselves or it was accidental, unless they left a note. And lots of people don't leave notes. Then you're left trying to read the tea leaves and figure out what their state of mind was when they made the decision they made to inject that last piece of fentanyl or whatever it is that they did. So this is a serious issue that the CDC recognizes. And yet another graphic just showing you how the suicide rates continue to grow over time. And this gives you very clearly where the greatest burden of suicide rates is. So if you look at suicide counts, so we've talked about rates, where the rates are highest at those over 75. The number of people who commit suicide, the most in men, is in the 35 to 54 age group. That's what the far left shows. It shows you the numbers. And the highest rate is on the far right, which is the men 75 and older. So suicide rate is highest in the oldest folks, but the number of people, given the sheer demographic population, is in the middle. And in fact, we have data that tells us that middle-aged men, 45 to 64, have the fastest growing rate of suicide. So the population in a matter of time now is going to change, where the highest rate isn't going to be in the oldest, it's going to be somewhere in the middle. And we're beginning to see that. In fact, in the veteran population, it's already shifted to be among that group. And the rest of the civilian population follows the veteran population over time. That is kind of scary, because that's supposed to be close to the peak of your life, where you're raising a family, you're becoming a fully influential member of society, you're at the peak of your prime. And if people are making that decision that early, that's a lot of work we got to do. This graphic here shows you how people choose to die. And if you look between 2000, so the first two on the left are 2005 data, male, 2015 data, male, and on the right is 2005 female and 2015 female. There's really no change in any of those graphics over time, except the predominant is what people do is mostly kill themselves using a firearm. And intentional poisoning follows as a close second. And there's also suffocation that's there. So those are the top ways people choose to kill themselves. And I'm going to head back to that in a second. So your paper slides don't match, because that's the older version. So up on the screen, I'm going to talk just briefly, because this isn't really much of a treatment intervention talk. I wanted to give you epidemiological data and challenge us to think about why that may be, and then talk about occupation-specific risks. So warning signs for suicide, those are the things that tell you that there is an increase in probability that someone might do something in the immediate future. And that's what those of us in mental health worry about immediately, that something is happening. This person is telling me something that I have to act right away. And we don't want to miss that, because we know most patients who end up dying from suicide show up at a doctor's office for one reason or another within the month before they end up dying. So it's important to be keyed in to things that make you wonder, maybe I need to act. Acute factors are things of brief duration. They're very stressful, and that's what can help overwhelm somebody's ability to cope. So the way I like to think about the decision to attempt suicide is all of us have certain amounts of ability to cope. Every single person does. Just like your immune system, you can fight with so much invaders from the outside, bacteria, viruses, whatever. At some point, everybody's immune system can be overreading. When that happens, you get sick, right? Same thing with being well and able to resist the urge to attempt to commit suicide. Everybody has coping skills to a certain level. Some people have really great coping skills, some don't. I'm sure you can think of people in your life and people in your professional life that fall in one end or the other of the spectrum. When there's enough stress from the outside, it can override whatever your coping skills may be, or you may degrade your coping skills. And then when that moment of crisis comes, you're unable to defend yourself. And that's when people may make those decisions. So it's a crisis that builds on multiple things. It's usually an impulsive decision when people make it. And then if you can get them past that particular time, you've saved someone's life. Because most people who end up trying to commit suicide don't do it again a second time. So our job is to stop them from trying the first time. Again, most people who end up attempting to commit suicide don't do it again a second time. There's a certain subset that goes on and does it multiple times, but the vast majority of people do not. So our job is, if we can stop you, help you in that time of crisis to find other ways to cope with the crisis. The chronic factors are part of all your underlying risks that stay on, that give you the propensity to succumb when you have that particular confluence of stress. And protective factors are things that each of us has intrinsically and that are outside that can keep you well. So things include your capacities, your qualities, things in your environment, your personal resources, your personal psychological makeup, having family, friends, relationships, those kinds of things. So here is just a little graphic that gives you what a continuum might look like about how somebody gets to the point where they may be at high risk for attempting to take their own lives. So at the very bottom of the risk is people, the things that are low risk, prior suicide attempts, gender, things we can't really do much about. But at the very top, high, when you know you need to intervene, is when somebody starts to prepare. So what kind of things would you think of as preparation or rehearsal behaviors for taking one's life? I'm sorry, giving away stuff, yeah? I'm sorry? Yeah, giving away stuff, saying goodbye, going on the website and searching for how do I kill myself, right? I mean, people sometimes joke about things like that, but in the mental health world, there's no such thing as joking about killing yourself, because people communicate. People communicate, they leak out. So when people start having that kind of conversation, you need to take them seriously, and you need to make sure you get them somewhere where somebody can check them out. Here are protective factors that, in the context of looking at things that can help someone stay alive. Because what you want to do is you want to boost up the protective factors. You want to boost up the coping skills and help them put some distance between them and the crisis. Once that time passes, they're over it for the majority of people. Some won't be, but this is how you can help most people. One of the common sayings in mental health is suicide is the permanent solution to a temporary problem. So you've got something that seems overwhelming. And I tell people, usually when you talk to someone who's at the edge of suicide, often with depression clouding them in, they're about the most selfish people you can think of on the planet, because they're pretty sure that the world is all about them. Everything is going to fall down and nothing anyone can do can make things better. So they'll say things like, if I was not here, my whole family would be better. Like, really? You really think your wife and your 2-year-old baby and your family and your friends, you really think they'll be happier if you're in here? But they're not rational at that point in time. It's hard for them to engage in irrational, because most rational people would sit down and go, this doesn't make sense. But when you're dealing with people at that point where the crisis has overwhelmed them, the ability to engage in rational thinking is hijacked by the first part of our brain that makes them think about all the worst possible outcomes. So they don't think about, but this may go away. My pain may get better. Somebody may love me. I may get another job. Those parts of the brain aren't working. So that's your job when you interact with somebody, whether you're a mental health professional or not, to help them see the way past today, the right now. Because if you get past the right now, past this huge wave that's threatening to overwhelm them, you give them a chance to live for another day. And again, the data says most people won't go and try it again. So you help save those people. So this is a nice little flow diagram that just goes, when you have somebody who is at a clinical state that's vulnerable for suicide, you assess, you intervene at that point, you provide treatment. Before they have, at the far end, the suicide attempt or completion, means restriction. Who's ever heard of means restriction? Okay. So means restriction, no, means restriction is restricting the means by which they might kill themselves. So meaning the most common way people kill themselves is with firearms. So the number one way we should try to intervene is if you have a firearm, we need to separate you from a firearm. If we can, there are other things we can do there, and I'll talk about that for the next few ones. And then when you get better, we can get you back to baseline or to recovery, where we boost up your protective factors. We monitor you, we help prevent relapse, we focus on wellness and try to get you as far away from the far end where you're feeling overwhelmed by the crisis. So, who was taught to use no suicide contracts? No one. No suicide contract. Who's heard of no suicide contracts? Okay. Who knows what the data says on no suicide contracts? They don't work. They don't work. They're worth the paper they're printed on. Nothing. No suicide contract entails you and the patient agreeing, hey, I'm not going to kill myself. If I'm going to kill myself, I'm going to call you first. And a lot of mental health professionals keep using it, even though the data says it doesn't help. It doesn't protect you in a malpractice case. It makes people feel falsely that the patient promised to call me before he killed himself. So I don't think he's going to kill himself. And it's not really patient-centered. What we recommend now, what's more evidence-based, is something called safety planning. Safety planning is a much more empirical version of what the no suicide contract attempts to do. So what it is after you do a risk assessment and you determine the patient is at risk of suicide, you sit down together and you walk through a safety plan. And this is an example there that I don't think you could read, but it goes through walking through what are your warning signs. Mr. X, I'm worried that you're showing signs that tell me you might want to hurt yourself. Tell me what things tell you might want to hurt yourself. And the patient will tell you, well, when I stop wanting to walk my dog, when I isolate, I stop going to work. Good, so you write them down, the patient's words, so it's you and the patient working this together. The second thing is you talk about internal coping strategies. So what kind of things can you do when you have those thoughts? Well, maybe I can force myself to walk my dog, or maybe I can call my sister, or maybe I can put on a movie that makes me happy. Good, you write that down too. And number three, social situations and people that can help distract me. You have the patient tell you the things that make him feel better. Listening to the Baby Shark song, yeah, or maybe that'll make them want to kill themselves, right? Looking at a beautiful sunset like we had, or the great lunar eclipse of the other day, you write that down. People who I can ask for help, you have the patient give names, write that down too, and then who are your professionals that you can reach out to? The patient gets that down, and then what can you do to make the environment safe? You talk about how the patient might kill themselves, and you write that down. So what you've done now, you've gone beyond you're not going to kill yourself to actually walking through the steps. And doing that cognitive work makes a difference. That's, even if you're a therapist, what you've just done is a very simple cognitive behavioral exercise. You've had them in their brain walk through the things that might cause them to harm themselves, and you've had them walk through how they can protect themselves, such that when the thought arises, when the crisis comes, when they're threatening to be blown over by what's going on, they will remember. It's like practicing before the event. They will remember. We have our people often posted in highly visible places. So by your fridge, by the telephone, by the door, whatever. Give copies to your family so you can remember that I have this thing, and you can go back and go, but I really want to kill myself. But it'll help you or give you the prong. Versus when you're in a crisis, and you can't think through all this because you won't be able to. Having things in writing that you've actually worked on, that you helped write down yourself, helps drive you to choose to stay alive. And so these are the steps that I just went through that you can do. And you can Google safety plan and find them anywhere. So lethality of suicide methods. Using firearms almost certainly guarantees you're going to die. How many people have seen folks who've survived a suicide attempt by gun? I have. And do most of them regret it, or are they happy? Do they regret that they tried to kill themselves, or do they regret that they survived? Yeah. There's films out there about survivors of the Golden Gate Bridge. I lived in Sacramento, and so went to San Francisco a few times and talked to those folks. And almost to a person, every one of those survivors, and there's like 30, 40, there's a video of all those guys. The first thing they tell you they thought about as they jumped is, oh my goodness, am I really doing this? Am I going to die? I don't want to die. That's important to recognize that, because many of us think most of these people really meant to die. The reality is most of them don't. And if we can stop them from doing something that's almost inevitably fatal, we save a life. So if you use a firearm, almost 90% of the time, you're going to die. But if you use any other method, only 5% of the time are they going to die. So look at that. If we could somehow restrict people's access to firearms when they're having the thoughts of hurting themselves, we can save a lot of people. We can reverse this trend that we have going on. So most suicides are by firearm, and building in time and space between the impulse to die and the means to die saves many lives. Lethal means safety is an important thing to do. So we have gun locks that we distribute everywhere in the VA. I hope within your organization you guys have access to gun locks to give people to. That what it does is the amount of time it takes you to unlock the gun lock, the acute crisis leaves you over, and then your rational brain can take control and say, hey, I'm going to deal with this a separate way. So other ways, if people don't want to do that, is sometimes you can ask people, would you be willing to take your gun and give it to somebody else to hold during this period of time? So you have a court case coming up and it's stressing you out. Is it okay if your brother holds it for you or somebody else that you trust? We're not taking your guns from you. We just want you to put it somewhere where the gun can be safe. And again, anything you do to separate time and space between that makes a difference. So a locked gun poses a lower suicide risk than an unlocked gun. So you lock up the gun in the safe. An unloaded gun poses a lower suicide risk. So, break it apart, take out the ammunition, lock them separately, put the key somewhere else. By the time you go through all the steps to do that, enough time would have passed that you can actually think and decide how you want to problem solve accurately. And so here's a graphic that shows you the multiple ways you can work with reducing your access to the firearm at the time that you're angry. How many of you have been in traffic, in road rage before, where if you had a loaded gun in your hand, you might have killed somebody? Okay, so you're like, oh, thank God I didn't carry one today, right? Because when you get emotional and you get upset, it's kind of hard to predict how you're going to react. And so being able to give yourself that time and space where you get rid of the emotion and then you can think more rationally is a life-preserving thing. So people with firearms are twice as likely to kill themselves than to kill the burglar. True, data fact. More people die by suicide than by homicide by guns all the time. And the most common victim with a homicide is a member in your household. And so thinking about firearm safety when people have periods of increased risk is an important thing. And here's websites and material that you can use to learn more about that. And on this page, I have a whole list of resources where people can learn about suicide prevention. And the slides that I have, again, aren't quite what you have on paper. I'll make sure Kathy gets this out so people can have access to that. So now I'm going to spend the last 5-10 minutes of the talk on occupation-based risk. So a few months ago, October and November, the CDC released, and you don't have that in your slides at all, the CDC released data on the occupations-based classes that were most likely to have a high risk of suicide. So there's some caveats with the data. First, it's only from 17 states, which probably isn't reflective of the entire United States. Number two, it's very broadly arranged. So there isn't one here that says physician, for example. Physicians and other healthcare practitioners fall under a big old group that has a whole bunch of different people. So it's a very broadly arranged group, but you can get some sense of the data from 2012 to 2015. And the top three are construction and extraction for males, art, design, entertainment, sports and media, and installation, maintenance, and repair for males. On the right side, females, number one was art, design, entertainment, sports, and media. Number two was protective service. Number three was healthcare support. On the male side, you see that the healthcare practitioners and technical went up from number 14 to number 8. So something there is telling us for the healthcare folks, there is an increase in suicide rate that's rising higher than the main population. And this is a summary of the graphic that shows that suicide rates have increased among the US population, and for the 17 states that reported data, that the highest rates were in there. And what we need to do is a comprehensive approach to suicide prevention, again, including in the workplace, because this isn't just something that affects people at home. It affects people everywhere. People live within a workspace. And so I'm going to talk some about physician suicide. I was told 3/4 of the way through my preparation for the talk to include information about physicians and other healthcare providers. So there is data on physician suicide. However, I'll caution you, it's not the greatest data. It's mostly based on old reporting. And so I wouldn't hang my hat on the accuracy of everything, but we do know enough going back in time that there's an increased risk of physician mental health issues, and suicide happens to be the end result of that. For nurses, there was no literature, nothing whatsoever until this past year, where a group came together by the National Academy of Medicine, so they're going to start looking at that. And for pharmacy, there's nothing out there too. So most of what's there is on physicians, and it's not the best, greatest data. But the hope is, because there's a lot of people focusing on this now, we'll begin to get good, more reliable data. The best guess is somewhere between 300 and 400 physicians die each year from suicide. And one group put it as a whole medical school dying a year. That's a lot of people. For every physician that dies by suicide, that's about 1 million patients affected that lose access to physicians. So this is part of our healthcare crisis, where we don't have enough healthcare providers for our patients. And male physicians are 1.4 times more likely to kill themselves than their male peers in the general population. Female physicians, 2.27 times more likely. And we think this is partly for females. You notice the females have a much higher rate than females out there. Can anybody guess why female physicians may be that much more likely to kill themselves than their female peers? I'm sorry? Yes. Do you think they try to kill themselves more than the average female physicians? Yes, no? Yeah, okay. Well, they don't attempt to kill themselves any more frequently than women in the general population. In fact, they do it less often. So what does that mean? That means they do it much more proficiently. They have access to means of suicide. And among physicians, unlike the general population where handguns and firearms were the predominant stuff, poisonings by using pills and other chemicals we have access to is a big source of how physicians choose to kill themselves. So when female physicians choose to kill themselves, they're much more likely to succeed than when the female in the average population does. So that's something worth remembering. There's an increased incidence in the topics of burnout, resilience, wellness, all that stuff. I'm sure you all have heard that before. That's a big focus in healthcare. And we know about a third of physicians across countries, across specialties around the world have burnout. Medical students have high risk, and these issues are beginning to arise in medical school. When I was teaching at UC Davis, every year for my first 3 years there, a medical student committed suicide. And that was kind of scary for all the faculty. And we put our heads together and we talked about this. But that was like my first exposure to this as an issue arising early on in medical education. And we don't teach students how to take better care of themselves, so they become residents, to become attendings, and the same issues persist, sometimes in worse ways. There's a data point that says about 30% of residents have significant depressive symptoms, and an intern study found 24% of interns developed suicidal thoughts within 3 months of starting internship. Think about that. Suicidal thoughts, that's a lot of people. That's scary, and that's stuff most people don't talk about, except the ACGME in the past year or two has recently mandated that all residency programs now begin to talk about wellness and self-care and take care of themselves, and we hope these kinds of things help. Doctors are less likely, as somebody said, to seek mental health treatment or any kind of treatment. You know, a doctor who has him or herself for a patient has a fool for a doctor. But we all do that. I do that. I'm giving this talk and I do that because it's so easy to do. Why don't physicians seek help? Because we don't talk about it. Because you're supposed to be strong, you're supposed to be resilient. Significant distress is part of our identity. Being a doctor means you're tough. Even though you had 3 people die in trauma in the ER that day, you just bounce up and go treat the next patient. That's what you do. Even though the patient you spent the past month trying to save eventually dies, the baby dies, again, you just go on and take care of the next one. You don't sit down and cry or tell people how this makes you feel, how traumatized you are at the thought of losing another one. We don't do that. We just go on. And people internalize this, and those things can often have very, very damning consequences down the road. And you know, there is something to be said for being able to withstand blows like losing patients and having bad stuff happen. But we're human. Doctors are just as human as anybody else do. If you cut us, we bleed. And if you forget that and you don't do the self-care that comes first. You know, when you're on the plane, they tell you, you know, the announcement, when the mask comes down, and it's, don't put the mask on the person next to you, even if it's your baby. You put it on yourself first before you can take care of a baby. Same thing for those of us in the healthcare occupations. Things like sleep deprivation, student loan debt, Pressure to never make a mistake, barriers that keep us from accessing mental health care. I know this from working with physicians and friends and colleagues over the years. Confidentiality. Most people are scared if somebody finds out. You're worried about what's going to happen with your license. Many people also, because you're a high functioning, you're a high charging physician, you have a hard time recognizing you need help, and you don't seek the help you need until it might be too late. Several things postulated about reasons for increasing physician distress, and you can see a bunch of them there. One of the things I've read a lot lately, so I'm the chief medical officer for my hospital, so I'm very acutely aware, interested in this. Electronic health records. Almost every physician blog or article I read talks about the cursed EMR. Those things can kill you. I tell you, literally and figuratively. So two articles that I saw over the past couple of months that were very interesting. Catchy headlines. One in the New England Journal was getting rid of stupid stuff. Anybody saw that? Google that and look that up. Great, great article. The other one by Atul Gawande in the New Yorker was Why Doctors Hate Their EHR. Beautiful titles. Again, talking about how these things which are supposed to help us haven't actually helped us. They've just made our lives more difficult. Because all you do is spend more time treating the chart. You go home on the weekends, you're charting. You never get a break from that. There's a decrease in autonomy. Most physicians now aren't self-employed. Most of us now are employed by somebody else. And something about that decrease in autonomy affects physicians in many ways. The healthcare world has changed a lot over the past couple of decades. I mean, if a bunch of physicians sit down together, they talk about how things have changed, how things used to be 10, 15, 20 years ago. Things aren't the same anymore. Malpractice guilt, that's a big one there, because I've been told by people who've been sued that even if you win, you never feel the same again. You question yourself, you doubt. And many people can't take the pain of being accused of not being the best, because that's how people interpret that. And so this is some of the things that push us in that direction. And some of what ends up happening is people self-medicate. The third bullet point there says, a postmortem study in 2013 showed that physicians who died by suicide had 20 to 40 times the rate of benzos, barbiturates, and antipsychotics in their system than non-physicians. That means they're doing something to themselves. That's scary, but you can all begin to imagine how that happens when it's easier for you to get something yourself or call your friend who give you a pill for whatever without going through the system. And that's another thing we do. You get the VIP treatment, but there's actually data saying getting the VIP treatment means you get bad medical treatment. That when we cut corners to do a favor for our colleague down the road, for our friend, we don't treat them with the same level of skepticism and stuff we would for any other patient. And in the end, we miss things we shouldn't have. And that's a challenge. That's something we all have to watch within ourselves when we're doing our friends a favor, because that favor may not be such a favor after all. So I talked about female physicians and what they do to make them more likely to die. The poisonings, the hangings. So firearms are still the biggest way physicians kill themselves, but it's a much smaller proportion now than it is in the general population. And the fact that we deal with death on a regular basis, regardless of your specialty, kind of desensitizes us to meaning of death. So some people think that may be why we're more likely to kill ourselves, just like military veterans, firefighters, police, because you're exposed over and over again to trauma and stuff. You also, you have the trauma within, and you're less likely to be scared of doing it because you already know what it looks like. You've seen it enough times. So the kind of things we can do, stigma reduction, which is what I'm doing here, to talk about it, to name it, to make it acceptable to seek help. Policy changes that make it easier for folks to go ahead and get help. Being able to recognize that all of us need help at some point in time. We all have defenses, and everybody has attacking forces attacking you, and it's just a matter of whether your defenses can hold up. Whatever we can do to build up our defenses will work. The military had this great campaign where generals came out and told people about their PTSD to encourage soldiers to seek help. And if we in medicine don't keep quiet, but talk about when things like this happen and encourage people to seek help, we can save a life. Creating the safety net employee wellness program. Many states have licensure requirements that require you to disclose if you've ever been treated for a mental illness, which is really not relevant. Mental illnesses are no more disabling than physical illnesses. If you ask the question, do you have any condition that stops you from practicing medicine? That's all you need to know, because it's the impairment that really matters. In fact, as I read through this, most states violate the American with Disabilities Act. It's just a matter of time before somebody wins the lawsuit that causes state medical boards to change that, because any employee with a disability, a mental illness is a disability as well, is entitled to a degree of privacy. And someday we'll see this all played out. Usually they settle the cases when people sue. There was a famous one out of Minnesota by a physician who's been very vocal about his mental illness stuff, and they were able to settle the case before he actually got to a judgment. And that's where it's been going. Promoting self-care, addressing burnout, addressing our own physical and mental health needs allow us to remain highly competent and resilient. And if we shift the lens to focus on mental health, we all will reap the positive outcomes, because the better we are able to take care of ourselves, the better we're able to take care of our patients. If we're not well, our patients won't get the best of us. Our families, our society won't get the best of us. And it allows us to be stronger, healthier physicians, better able to serve the needs of those we treat. I have a few references there. There's a documentary that came out in 2018 that goes through several physician suicides. It's pretty eye-opening, should you choose to watch that. There's a couple of websites that actually catalog and count physician suicides in the media and talk about things we can do. And this is how I'm going to end this. So 400 US physicians take their own lives every year. Let's talk about it. It's from the National Academies of Medicine, and you can go to the website and you can see all kinds of information there. And they have this information as well for other healthcare professions. So that's the end of my talk. I'll take any questions.